June 6, 1944 began like any other rainy morning for German sentries stationed along the Atlantic Wall in Normandy. The weather had been terrible for days, with high winds and driving rain that made even the most dedicated lookout want to stay inside his bunker with a cup of coffee and a cigarette. German meteorologists had assured their commanders that no invasion could possibly come in such conditions. The seas were too rough, the visibility too poor, and the Allies would never risk their massive invasion fleet in such a storm. As dawn broke grey and sullen over the English Channel, many German soldiers were still asleep in their beds, confident that this would be just another quiet day guarding Hitler's fortress Europe. Then they heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it didn't fade away like thunder should. Instead, it grew louder and louder until it became impossible to ignore. German lookouts scrambled to their observation posts, wiping rain from their binoculars, trying to peer through the grey morning mist to identify the source of this ominous noise. What they saw when the haze finally lifted was something that challenged their understanding of what was humanly possible. The English Channel, which had been empty the night before, was now filled from horizon to horizon with ships. Not just a few ships, not even hundreds of ships, but thousands upon thousands of vessels of every conceivable size and description. Massive battleships sat alongside tiny landing craft. Destroyers escorted transport vessels. And somewhere in that vast armada were the supplies, equipment, and manpower that would change the course of human history. One German observer later wrote that it looked as if someone had moved an entire city onto the water and pointed it straight at the French coast. But the ships were only the beginning of what would become the greatest logistical achievement in military history. As the first waves of Allied troops stormed ashore at Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, German commanders quickly realized they weren't just facing an invasion. They were witnessing the systematic relocation of American industrial capacity across 3,000 miles of ocean. Within hours of the initial landings, American engineers were already at work constructing artificial harbors, laying temporary roads, and establishing supply depots that would soon rival major European ports in their capacity to handle cargo. The scale of American preparation became clear as the hours turned to days and the days to weeks. German intelligence officers, studying captured documents and interrogating prisoners, discovered that America had not simply planned an invasion, they had planned to rebuild the infrastructure of an entire continent. American factories had produced specialized equipment that existed nowhere else in the world. Floating docks that could be towed across the ocean and assembled in enemy waters. Portable bridges that could span rivers in hours rather than months. And prefabricated buildings that could house entire divisions within days of landing. What truly staggered German observers was the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that began operating just 3 days after D-Day. This wasn't just a supply line, it was a mechanized river of material that flowed from the Normandy beaches deep into the heart of France, 24 hours a day. 6,000 vehicles, most of them driven by African-American servicemen who had been relegated to support roles but proved themselves heroes nonetheless, carried 12,500 tons of supplies every single day along carefully planned routes that bypassed German strongpoints and kept Allied armies advancing at a pace that German forces simply couldn't match. General Erwin Rommel, inspecting the damage after unsuccessful counterattacks against the Allied beachhead, reportedly told his staff that fighting the Americans was like trying to hold back the ocean with their bare hands. Every time German forces destroyed a bridge, American engineers had already built 2 more. Every time they captured a supply depot, they discovered it was just one of dozens feeding the Allied advance. The Americans weren't just fighting a war, they were performing an act of continental engineering that moved mountains of material across impossible distances with machine-like precision, the literal truth of moving. Mountains became apparent during the construction, of the Mulberry harbours, artificial ports that allowed the Allies to unload cargo directly onto the Normandy beaches. These engineering marvels, conceived in British laboratories and built in American shipyards, consisted of massive concrete structures that were floated across the English Channel and sunk in precise positions to create sheltered harbours where none had existed before. German engineers who later examined the remains of these structures admitted they represented a level of planning and execution that they had never imagined possible as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their race across France. German resistance crumbled, not because of superior tactics or better weapons, but because they were facing an enemy that could logistically support military operations at a scale that defied comprehension. American units advanced so quickly that their biggest problem wasn't German resistance, it was staying ahead of their own supply lines. Patton's Third Army covered more ground in a single month than German forces had retreated in the previous year. Sustained by a logistical system that delivered fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements with clockwork regularity, the psychological impact on German forces was devastating. Soldiers who had spent years believing in their own technological and organizational superiority found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and the ability to deploy them anywhere, anytime, under any conditions. German veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to the massive scale of warfare against the Soviet Union, admitted that even Russia's impressive industrial capacity paled in comparison to what America had achieved in moving an entire army across an ocean and then supplying it indefinitely in enemy territory. By the time American forces reached the German border in September 1944, the lesson was complete. Germany had learned that America possessed something more dangerous than superior weapons or brilliant generals. They had the ability to project their industrial strength anywhere in the world and sustain it indefinitely. The United States had quite literally moved mountains of material, equipment and supplies across the Atlantic Ocean, through enemy-controlled waters, onto hostile beaches, and then supported advancing armies across hundreds of miles of contested territory without ever missing a delivery. When German commanders surrendered in May 1945, many admitted they had been defeated not by American soldiers, brave as they were, but by American logistics. The nation that had once been dismissed as a collection of farmers and shopkeepers had demonstrated an organizational capacity that changed forever how wars would be fought and won. America had shown the world that victory in modern warfare belonged not necessarily to the side with the best weapons, but to the side that could move mountains and keep them moving until the job was done.